Good evening and welcome to Columbia Law School. My name is Michael Gerard. I'm on the faculty here. I teach environmental law and energy law and founded and direct the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which is co-sponsoring this evening's program together with Columbia's Earth Institute. The Sabin Center develops legal techniques to fight climate change, trains the next generation of lawyers to use those techniques, and creates and posts informational materials, legal research materials, databases on climate litigation, regulations and statutes, and many other activities. We put on many public events like this one. We're having another one coming up next Wednesday, October 23rd from 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. on the subject of implementation of New York State's new climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is one of the strongest climate laws in the world. And so we'll be talking about implementation of that law, and I hope that some of you come to that. More information about that event and our other activities can be found at our website, which is www.columbiaclimatelaw.com. And there's more information on the literature table and back. Superstorm Sandy in 2012 caused widespread destruction in the New York and New Jersey metropolitan area. Even more powerful hurricanes have, in the last couple of years, struck and done enormous damage in Puerto Rico, Houston, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, the Bahamas, and other parts of the United States and around the world. These events were not caused by climate change, but increasing scientific evidence is suggesting that the severity and perhaps the frequency of extreme weather events is being caused by the warming of the oceans and the atmosphere. All this has led to increased attention to the vulnerability faced by our region. So the United States Army Corps of Engineers has instituted a project called the New York, New Jersey Harper and Tributaries Focus Area Feasibility Study. Because it's about harbor and tributaries, it's called the HATS study. We're here this evening to learn more about this study and the alternatives that it is looking at, including the possibility of one or more storm surge gates. Most people in the region are unaware of the study, but its results can have major economic and environmental impacts. So the Sabin Center felt it's important to increase public understanding of what is now being examined. We'll hear first from a representative of the Corps of Engineers, then from a climate scientist who will tell us about the latest projections on sea level rise and other coastal events in the region, and then from a proponent of the construction of storm surge barriers, and then from an opponent of construction. I'll introduce each speaker before he or she speaks. After they're all done, we'll open up the floor for questions. We'll end at 8:30 p.m. The program is being videotaped. We'll post a video on the website, and at this time you know what to do with your cell phones. First, to present what is now being studied, we're honored to have Clifford S. Jones III, who is Chief of the Planning Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the New York District. He's substituting for Colonel Thomas Asbury, the district engineer, who had a last-minute conflict. The New York District is responsible for the Corps of Engineers' water resource development, navigation, and regulatory activities in the northeastern New Jersey, eastern and south central New York State, including New York Harbor and Long Island and parts of Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Mr. Jones has been with the Corps since 1988 and has led numerous key projects. He recently received the Civilian Award for Humanitarian Service for his contribution to recovery and improved resiliency in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. Clifford Jones.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everybody. You covered a lot about our organization and kind of what we do. I am Clifford Jones, and I am the Chief of Planning, responsible for feasibility studies within the Corps of Engineers within New York District. Basically, those feasibility studies, we look at answering one fundamental question. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And with that, there are a couple of fundamental sub-questions, if not objectives, that we have to go along with that. Basically, do we have an engineeringly sound solution for the problem that we're trying to solve? Is it economically justified? And are there any environmental impacts that go along with that? With that, I mean, we try to study and bring those studies to the public, to the stakeholders involved, to make sure that we're delivering on what the commitments that we have, what we've been asked to do. As discussed, so we have one study in front of us, the New York Harbor and New York and New Jersey Harbor and Tributary study, aka the HAT study. Just by show of hands, how many people are familiar with this study? All right, so I'm done here. And just by show of hands, so we are partnering this study with the state of New York, the state of New Jersey, as well as contributing with New York City in our senior executive management group. So representatives from New York, New Jersey, New York City, and the Corps that are in the audience, if you could raise your hands. All right, so I know who to go to phone a friend. All right, appreciate it. Appreciate you guys coming out. And I'll try to work this as best I can. There we go. All right, so our study area basically covers the New York and New Jersey metropolitan area. Everything within the Hudson, leading all the way up through the Hudson, as far as that storm surge that we've seen reached from Hurricane Sandy. Most of that is shown in the green there. I'll just try to keep pointing to areas. I have a screen there, a screen here, a screen above me. So that green area covers our study area. We similarly have other studies going on to look at similar impacts of the New Jersey Back Bay areas, and to the east, the Nassau County Back Bay areas. So all three of these are going on at the same time, and we're trying to make sure that we're coordinating all three to make sure that we're consistent in how we're approaching the studies, as well as realizing where the water's going and the impacts from all three, because I think it's pretty obvious to say that water knows no political boundaries, so making sure that we're giving the right answers to that fundamental question and how we can reduce the threats, the risk of coastal storm damage. A little bit about study information and the history of it. So after Hurricane Sandy, we conducted, and this is probably old news for a lot of you, but we conducted a study of the entire North Atlantic coastal comprehensive study, which was basically everything from Virginia to Maine, and identified several key areas. And this is one of those key areas that was identified as vulnerable to the impacts as seen by Hurricane Sandy. In August of 2016, we signed an agreement with New York State and New Jersey to get this study started. And we started partnering and reaching out to folks to let people know what it is that we were doing. We're trying to be transparent through the entire course of the study. So I appreciate the invite here. And yes, Colonel Asbury was regretful that he couldn't make it, but I'll do my best on his behalf. And with that, reached out to the federal agencies, as well as tried to conduct meetings, public meetings, with the general public in multiple areas. And we'll continue that process as the study moves on. We're also engaged with the political, municipality levels to make sure that those agencies or communities that are responsible for different areas know what we're doing and the impacts of what we're doing and how we're proposing to answer several of the questions. This is kind of where we are in the timeline. It's might be a little confusing map, but and I'm sure it's difficult to read. But just to go on with it, so like I said, we had the agreement in 2016. Had a couple of series of milestones, and as many of you might recall, we had an interim project report that was sent out in October of 2018. So last year, we had that report sent out, and that was kind of the draft of where we are in the study using some of the information that came out of that North Atlantic comprehensive study to guide us as to what our alternatives were, where the cost might be, what the range of environmental impacts might be, so identifying what we should be looking at to scope out the rest of the study, preliminary cost estimates, benefits that go into how we're going to formulate this study. That report went out, and we had a series of meetings, got back a lot of comments from the general public, from the agencies, as to guide us as to what we should do. Within the Corps of Engineers and with our partners, we had a risk-informed workshop that basically looked at, are we doing the right things? And based on all of the comments that came in, are we addressing the right things within the study? And basically came to agreements and how we're going to proceed from here, recognizing the comments that came in. After this, so next year, and we pushed it out a little bit, but in May of next year, we expect to have what we call a tentatively selected plan milestone. And with the information that we have now, moving forward, we expect to identify a tentative plan to address the problem that we're trying to solve in reducing the threat of coastal storm damage to the metropolitan area of New York and New Jersey. Then with that, the process goes on to an agency decision milestone, and ultimately we would need a decision from the Chief of Engineers to actually approve anything, and then forward that to Congress and ultimately get it approved and authorized, and there's a whole process that deals with that. So we're quite a while from implementing anything. Just an overview of the alternatives, and this is what was in the report that was sent out. So we start out with the no action alternative, and that basically sets the standard as to what happens if we do nothing. And that's the current situation as well as looking forward. And in looking forward, we're looking at what happens by doing nothing with the extreme events that continue to happen, with the sea level that continues to rise, and what's the jeopardy, what are the risks involved in that. We had a series of alternatives for that, and one was a harbor-wide gate, one was multiple bay and basin gates, a single water body gate for each water body within the metropolitan area, and what we call a perimeter only. So if there's no gates, then looking at the perimeters of each of the vulnerable locations and identifying separate solutions for each of them. I'll go into a little bit more detail in this. So when we look at set up the no action, or what we call the future without project condition, it is looking at the area, and there's been a lot of work that multiple agencies, the states, have been doing. So we try to tap into what's already been done, and basically anything that's already been done or has an approved water quality certificate or approved mechanism to actually construct, those are calculated within the without project future. And that sets that baseline of how we move forward. Anything above that baseline then becomes, if we can try to reduce that risk, becomes a benefit to the project. And that benefit is then calculated against the cost for each of those projects. With that, and looking forward, looking at each alternative, we look at the effects of relative sea level change. So looking at the without project future condition, what then happens within each of these sea level change predictions? Now, these lines, and the importance of these lines, I'm just going to say, is that there are many different curves that are used. And we have our own within the Corps, whether it's a low or historic rate or a high level rate of sea level rise. And then the state has theirs, state of New York has theirs, state of New Jersey has theirs, New York City has theirs, NOAA. We try to tap into the wealth of information that's out there, the science that's out there, and rather than having to model every scenario of sea level change, we try to pick one which is basically that middle curve, that intermediate rate, and then use that to determine the tentative plan. And once that's done, if we can use that, we also have to evaluate the risks of what happens if we make the wrong decision on sea level rise. How does that impact the plan selection? using that also, then we pick the plan, then we still have to identify each of those curves and then look at the sensitivity of each of the curves. Does the plan even still work at the high rate of sea level rise? Our typical period of analysis is 50 years, but that sea level rise is going to continue, so we look at least 100-year out to see what that is going to do and what that might do to any plan that we end up selecting. When we start going into the alternatives from the interim report, and I'm not going to dwell too much on the interim, but I am going to give you a little preview, because as we've been working since the interim report, and like I said, since that risk-informed workshop, we have modified things a little bit based on the information that's coming in. So basically, and just in a nutshell, the alternative 2 is, and I'll say it, he's not here, so Colonel Asbury refers to it as the Asbarrier. So it's the large barrier. It's about a 6-mile span of a barrier. Please don't take that down anywhere. But it's the large barrier that basically bridges Brooklyn to Sandy Hook. And that barrier, the intent of that is basically to resolve, if we're trying to solve the problem of reducing that risk and reducing the storm surge into metropolitan New York and New Jersey, that barrier would be there to protect the entire area. That barrier, the relative cost of that, as we're seeing now, is about $62 billion. Now, what we are seeing, though, is that even with that $62 billion, the amount of damages that can be prevented by having that are in the range of $130 billion. So, and that's over the course of time. That's over that 50-year period, that horizon that we look in the planning horizon. So there is justification or potential justification for that. We look at alternative 3A, which then takes that large barrier out, but has a series of smaller barriers, if you can make that out, starting with the Verrazano, something within the Verrazano, then tying back in to something at the Throgs Neck, to again reduce that risk that's happening within that New York and New Jersey metropolitan area, but doesn't have that full level of protection. But we are seeing, so that then reduces the cost maybe half as much, having similar damages avoided. And you said 15 minutes, right? I'm trying. So we updated as well alternative 3B, and 3B looks similarly, but now takes out even the barrier at Verrazano, and then for multiple water bodies, you'll have separate alternatives for each of those that'll have gates at different water bodies. Again, similar costs, and I'll go into a table that shows the comparative cost of each of them. And then alternative 4, similarly, with smaller water bodies, but the importance of 4 and even 3B is that Jamaica Bay then becomes separated out. So it'll have its own gate to cover Jamaica Bay. We actually did look at this in a previous report under the Rockaway report to try and bring the entire system of the Rockaways in, but there were definitely concerns with that, so we wanted to push the Rockaways ahead and build that into this HAT study. Looking at 4, again, similarly with the smaller water bodies, and then 5, if we basically try to protect with perimeter solutions, looking at separate actions to address each of the vulnerable areas within the entire metropolitan area. Now, you can see the cost goes down again here, so $14 billion for a plan like this, but what's notable is that the percentage of risk avoided goes way down also. So you then have a lot of residual risks if you then put that plan in without addressing the bigger problem that we're trying to solve. And then, kind of in a nutshell, with all of the alternatives combined, you see that we have costs. And here's where I guess it becomes interesting. So between 3A and 3B, we find that, if you will, sweet spot where the costs become lessened. Yeah, lessen to a certain extent anyway, and your residual risks aren't as large. So we're trying to target, again, that sweet spot to get to our TSP. Where do we find that cost reduced and the benefits increased so we can get that high BCR, the benefit cost ratio, and have increased net benefits? And all of this will continue as we go on. We do have to consider and definitely have to factor in, once we get to our plan selection, what are the environmental considerations? And in addition to the environmental considerations, I'll just say, so each of these plans, especially with the surge barriers, what we're in the process of doing now, we put a surge barrier in, there's going to be some risk that happens because that water is going to find a place to go. Where does that water go? And what is that influence? Because we don't want to, one of the problems that we're trying to solve, we don't want to make things worse for anybody. So if we put a big barrier in, then it could very well be that that water finds a way to adjacent areas. And we are calculating what that is and what that does, so that becomes almost, if you will, a negative benefit to the project. And that also gets calculated in, and that then factors into our plan selection. Environmental considerations, we look at the whole change of tidal range, flow velocity, salinity, sedimentation rates, scour and elevation, all of the topics that we pretty much talk on the environmental side. So there are a lot of considerations that go in. We've identified what they are. Once we identify what the plan that we're going to be focused in on, then we actually have to go out and do the investigations to see what's out there and what we might be altering. And then, again, have that transparency so everybody knows as well what it is that we're doing. And with that, I will leave. Appreciate the time.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to introduce Jackie Osterman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Health and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University and works on better understanding how sea level and ice sheets have changed over the past hundreds, thousands, and millions of years. The aim of this work is to better understand the stability of ice sheets and magnitude of sea level rise in response to warming temperatures. She received her PhD in Earth Sciences from Harvard in 2016. She was at Cambridge University as a Newton International Fellow before joining the Columbia faculty in 2018. In 2019, she was honored with the Jason Morgan Early Career Award from the American Geophysical Union. She's currently working on projects with field sites in the Bahamas and Barbados to better understand sea level changes during past warm periods. She's also an investigator on the Greenland Rising Project, which aims to better constrain past, current, and future sea level change around Greenland and involve local communities in this endeavor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm actually showing you, thank you so much for this introduction, a picture here from the Bahamas where we're doing some of this field work, trying to better understand how sea level is changing in a warmer world. So today here I will be talking to you about kind of giving you the scientific basis for all of this discussion. So I'll be presenting kind of the most recent predictions of sea level and storm surges. And what I'm going to be presenting today is largely based on the NPCC report that was published this year. So my talk's kind of roughly split in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about sea level change and tidal flooding, and these all are issues that are not addressed by surge gates or surge barriers. And then in the second part, I will be focusing on storm surges. Okay, so I'm going to start with kind of just setting the stage with this plot here, which is the record of sea level change at the Battery. You can see, let's see if I can do this here. Down here, this is, if you're next time down at Battery Park, you can look out for this white hut, which is where the tide gauge is actually stored that measures sea level at the Battery. You see in this trend here on the x-axis time going forward from the 1860 to today, and then on the y-axis sea level change in inches. And what you will see here through this rising slope of this curve is that sea level has risen by about 20 inches or 50 centimeters since 1860, and that this rise has indeed accelerated since about the 1990s. The current rates that we're dealing with of sea level rise in New York City is close to 4 millimeters per year. Sea level is rising globally. However, the magnitude by which it does vary from place to place, which is roughly depicted by this figure here. The global mean sea level rise is about 3 millimeters per year, which is quite a bit lower than in New York City. And global mean sea level rise has also accelerated since about over kind of the last couple of decades. The reason that sea level change in New York City is different from kind of the global mean sea level is that there are a lot of causes, a lot of effects that can cause local sea level change. And some of them are, the main ones are depicted here. So for example, local vertical land motion, so the Earth kind of lifting up or subsiding over time, can cause sea level change. And in fact, in New York and all along the US East Coast, the solid Earth is subsiding and causing additional sea level change that is not noted in other places around the world. But of course, going forward, the main contributor to sea level change that we worry about is, one, thermal expansion of the oceans, as well as mass changes. That means glaciers and ice sheets melting. I'm going to show you here just a little video of mass loss changes from Antarctica over the last couple of decades. Areas, so we're looking at a map of Antarctica here, areas that are starting to pop up in red are areas where there is significant mass loss over this time period. And as you will see, this area here is Western Antarctica, and this is the part that we're most concerned about in terms of sea level change within the century and over the next couple of centuries. It's the part that's melting most today, and it's actually the part that will affect New York City the most, because as an ice sheet melts, it actually doesn't, the sea level rise isn't uniform across the globe, but it does affect different locations differently, and Western Antarctica is particularly important for sea level change in New York. So on to kind of the predictions. So here on this plot, again, I'm showing you time on the x-axis, and then I'm showing you sea level change in feet on one side and in meters for any non-Americans on the other side. The kind of wiggly line that you see, this is the observed sea level change that I showed you earlier from Battery Park. So all of these predictions are for New York City. And here are kind of 4 predictions for 4 time periods. So this is for the 2020s, 2050s, 2080s, and 2100. What you see is kind of this weird marker where essentially that box shows you a quite likely range of sea level rise over this time period, whereas these up and down whiskers show you kind of the 10th and the 90th percentile of that probability distribution. So also plausible, unlike, not as likely, but plausible values for sea level change over this time period. What you see is that by 2100, sea level change of about 3 feet or about 1 meter is well within the range of what is possible and indeed expected. There are a couple of kind of high and low probability scenarios, and these are actually related to Western Antarctica. So there are processes in Western Antarctica that we don't yet fully understand, and there's a lot of work going on to try to better understand these. If Western Antarctica indeed is very unstable, the sea level change could even be higher. However, this is a very low probability scenario at this point in time. These, I should have probably said at the beginning, of course, these uncertainties stem from our incomplete knowledge about how much emissions are going to change over this time period, related to that, how much temperatures are going to change, and then that's going to feed into how much the ice sheets are going to change over this time period. So there are uncertainties in all of these kind of links in that kind of chain of logic, which cause these relatively large uncertainties in sea level change predictions. Which areas of New York City does this affect? We've already seen kind of some of these maps. So what I'm showing you here now are areas that in green are within 1 meters of sea level. The yellow and orange are areas up to 2 meters, and then red are up to 3 meters. If I'm kind of comparing the sea level rise predictions that I've just showed you to these kind of areas, you see that by 2100, with kind of a conservative, I would say, assumption of 1 meters or 3 feet of sea level rise, everything that's in green, light and dark green will be constantly inundated. On top of kind of the mean sea level rise, of course, we have a tidal range that can be quite significant. At Battery, that's about 4.5 feet, whereas in Jamaica Bay, that's up to 6 feet. And this tidal range can cause flooding, and it is already causing flooding today. This is generally referred to as tidal flooding or nuisance flooding, and is the minor recurring flooding that takes place at high tide. Of course, there's semi-diurnal tide, so high tide occurs twice a day, but this high tide is modulated over the year, and there are actually kind of peak high tides during which flooding already today occurs several times in different parts of New York City, and here's some examples. The frequency of this flooding has already doubled over the last 60 years, and with kind of the sea level rise changes within the century, this nuisance flooding will increase as well. Before I move on to the storm surge part, it's important to note that kind of all the things that I talked about and all the risks that I talked about so far are risks that would not be addressed by a storm surge gate. Moving on to storm surges. I'm sure you all know this, but just to kind of recap anyways. So what is a storm surge? So essentially it's the water piling up in front of an incoming storm. It's mainly wind-driven, but has a smaller pressure-driven component as well. And that kind of piled up water is then pushed on land. The storm surge the surge is particularly bad if it coincides with a high tide, which is, for example, what happened during Sandy, and then it's referred to as a storm tide, which is the storm surge plus a normal high tide. And here, kind of a little bit of comparison of what historic storm tides and the elevation of different parts around the city. So Hurricane Sandy had a storm tide of about 11.5 feet. And then this is based on also from the MPCC report actually, but here you see kind of picked out a couple of locations that are below that storm tide. The storm tide was actually relatively uniform around the city, but a lot of areas were submerged during that time. Okay, also here now I'm going to move on to the predictions. The way I'm going to talk about these predictions is in terms of their return period. So that's shown on the x-axis here. So a return period of 1 year is essentially storms that occur on average every year. 10 years means bigger storms that only happen every 10 years, etc. Again, you see the storm tide height in both feet and meters shown here. So kind of extratropical storms that come through almost every year have a storm tide of about 4 meters, and then the storm tides of less frequent, more intense storms are for the 10-year return period, for example, about 7 feet. For 100-year return period, 7 to 12-ish feet. And Hurricane Sandy was kind of on the upper end of that 100-year storm. So this is from a range of models. I'm showing you now in red the points are the values used by FEMA for kind of flood insurance purposes, so they are on the higher end of these estimates. And I should say that these estimates are done without taking into account sea level rise over time. So even though this is a 100-year storm, of course it matters whether this happens today or whether this happens at 2100 when sea level is already higher. So when we can take this into account as well, which is what Philip Orton did in the MPCC report. So now I'm showing you kind of the storm tide height if this storm occurred in 2020. Again, I'm going to show kind of uncertainties in this manner, 2050s, 2080s, and 2100. So as expected, if this big storm happened in 2100, sea level is already a lot higher. Also, then the storm tide would be significantly higher. I should mention that kind of the intensity, so this accounts for the sea level rise over the century. However, it does not incorporate any changes in the intensity or frequency of these storms that might arise from climate change. This is still debated, and particularly the exact storm tracks are not resolved, and so how much this will actually affect New York City is still up for debate. Another way of kind of interpreting these kind of study results is that by 2100, what would be called a 100-year flood today will occur about every 5 to 50 years, and what would be called like a 500-year flood will occur every 25 to 250 years. And I'm going to end on this. This is a map kind of showing, before I just showed you the areas that are prone to sea level rise. Now this is areas that are kind of within the limit of a 100-year flood. Today, so this is the FEMA values in purple, and then assuming kind of constant sea level rise in blue, green, and then yellow, which kind of indicates more and more of the city. And these values, where there, the storm tide is of course a lot higher than for the sea level predictions, and these are kind of the effects that the storm surge gates would address if the storm happens within the century. And with that, I am thanking you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And for the people standing in back, there are plenty of seats up front if you would like to come on down. So Malcolm Bowman had a medical issue and is unable to join us this evening, but I'm very pleased that Suzanne DiGeronimo has been able to join us on very short notice. She's a licensed architect and planner and is president of DiGeronimo Architects, which provides architectural and engineering services to the military. She focuses on resiliency issues and has held leadership positions in the Society of American Military Engineers. She's active in the Storm Surge Working Group, which advocates for a combination of strategic low walls for rising seas and storm surge gates. She attended the Cooper Union School of Architecture and the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation.
Thank you. Okay, so I changed this. It's now storm surge gates instead of storm surge barriers. With your permission, sorry about that. We're here. We're talking about. It's forward here. There you go. We're talking about being vulnerable, and Jacqueline was mentioning the characteristics of a storm surge. But Sandy also hit us at a full moon, which also increased the volume of the water that we received at the inundation. The storm surges are very dangerous because the water comes to land very frequently before the storm hits. And quite frankly, it was only a superstorm. It wasn't even a hurricane. So you didn't have the winds, and you didn't have the rain that would be typical in a hurricane. These are the mapped areas of hurricanes that we haven't really had yet at this particular point in our region. 100-year storm means that there's a good chance, 30%, that we're going to have another kind of superstorm Sandy or another kind of hurricane within the length of a 30-year mortgage. So our advocacy is to protect the region. Our advocacy is to protect 94.7% of the total risk. And this is a schematic diagram of what it is we're looking to do. We're looking to have an outer harbor gateway from Sandy Hook, New Jersey to Jamaica Bay on Long Island. It's about 5 miles. Then we would need a little East Rockaway barrier at that inlet, a Jones Inlet, And then also you need to have one at the East River. So you're looking at this sequence of barriers, and we're calling that a system. If you have a hurricane, what we've got in the New York City area is like a funnel. So a hurricane gathers strength in the outer harbor and creates a wind situation, and the wind also comes in from the north from a Long Island Sound as well. This particular series of barriers and gates, if you will protect the whole entire Hudson Bay, which the flooding went all the way up to Poughkeepsie. Flooding was inundated up there. The Hudson River has only an 18-foot differential between Albany and New York City. So the flooding went all the way up the Hudson River. The flooding went into New Jersey, of course, and the two rivers and the Raritan Bay. So this barrier protects our whole region. It protects our airports and the ports, our seaports and LaGuardia Airport, Newark, Hoboken, and the whole entire metropolitan area. So what we are is we're just an ad hoc group of stakeholders, and we're dedicated to the premise that protecting the greater metropolitan region against catastrophic flooding from ocean storm surges, climate change, and rising seas can be best secured by a regional approach that transcends geographical and political boundaries. And I think that's really what this whole conference is all about today. We're affiliated with the National Institute for Coastal and Harbor Infrastructure. What we're looking at, just to give you a picture in your mind, is something that's in England right now, London, the Thames gates. It's 520 meters long. It's a wide stretch of the river, and it divides the river into 4 61-meter segments. It is open most of the time, and it allows the waters to flow and shipping channels to flow as well. The gates rotate up from the bottom when there's a storm surge. So if we had a prediction of a storm surge, if we had something of this nature, the gates would rotate up at low tide, so that it would always be low tide up into the Hudson River Bay. Storm surge could come. The storm surge could be 12 feet. It could be 15 feet outside that barrier, and we would only ever see that low tide within the barrier itself, past the barrier gates. There are other kinds of gates that are considered. These are swing-style gates that are in St. Petersburg and other areas of our country, the Netherlands, of the globe. But Europe's busiest ports are all protecting themselves against storm surge. And it's an acceptable arrangement that allows for tidal exchange, which is essential to any kind of healthy estuary. All right, so we have increased cost and diminished benefits. We have challenges and cost issues and funding, completion deadlines. The significant increases in project costs can be overestimated if the cost estimation that the Corps of Engineers is using goes forward over 25 years. If it takes 25 years to build this thing, Corps of Engineers has to escalate the costs that they have, and it adds to the project costs. Reductions are costs avoided, but it's difficult for any system, Corps of Engineers as well, to really put a number on our transit systems and our other systems that we have here in the New York area. The cost-benefit ratio is really critical, because when we go to the federal government, to Congress for funding, the Corps of Engineers mentioned that they're partners with the federal government, New York City, New Jersey, and with input from New York City. Well, there is a funding ratio that's going to be part of that. So the federal government is going to fund a portion of that, and the states are going to fund a portion of that. So we're going to have to go at some point before Congress, and Congress is going to say, well, look at all these projects across the United States, and your New York City project only has a 1-to-2 cost-benefit ratio. And what we want in Texas is a 1-to-17 cost-benefit ratio, so we're going to go and fund the one in Texas. So the cost-benefit ratio is really, really important to have established right for us to be able to get this storm surge system in place. Our New Orleans storm surge gate, you know what? They were constructed in less than 5 years after Katrina, and they only cost $14.4 billion. I mean, it's not really only, but honestly, it was done. Houston storm surge gates planning phase is in less than 10 years, less than 3 years it's been planned. And there are also storm surge gates in Stamford, Connecticut, and Providence, Rhode Island, Bedford, Massachusetts. All of these are being used today very, very well. And the surge gates in the Netherlands, which are the largest in the world, took 10 years and at a cost of $2.5 billion. So the stakes are too high. We ought to be afforded similar construction completion timeframes and reasonable cost estimates and outlay for construction completion. Local projects, local land-based projects, these are generally being funded in our region just because of the availability of Sandy HUD funding and Sandy FEMA funding and state funds that are coming in. But what these typically are, these are more reactionary. So what we've done is we've put people back in harm's way by elevating the houses, by putting people back where they belong. Certainly everybody wants to be in their homes, but it's not the same as having a protection for the whole region that will prevent the whole region from flooding through storm surge. Many local projects and investments are in the aftermath are in progress now, but you know by the end of the day they're going to end up costing more to permit and build, and they may never actually get into fruition. So in combination, if you took all of the shoreline projects that are out there, and there are several hundred at this point, if you add them all up, they may add up to, and in fact be more than, the cost to build this storm surge gate that we're talking about. So we're proponents of doing the proper science and to assess effectiveness and consequences of our seat gate system that we're advocating. We don't think it's responsible that the idea be abandoned, that the storm surge barrier gate, if you will, system that we've advocating would be abandoned. Many effects are being stated, many effects are being stated that may not be in fact true among our associate organizations, and there is really no other credible defense against storm surge than a barrier of this type. And so I would like to send a challenge to Riverkeeper, I know he's up next, that we should have a one-on-one debate about storm surge and working group. And
my lucky day.
We say it should happen in the next 30 days, and so that the Riverkeeper can substantiate your claims. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Paul Gallet does have the title of Hudson Riverkeeper. He's president of the Riverkeeper organization. His team works to protect the Hudson River and the drinking water supplies of 9 million New Yorkers. He left the private practice of law in 1987 and went to work for the New York State Attorney General. In 1990, he began a 10-year stint with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Paul subsequently spent a decade in the land conservation movement before becoming Riverkeeper's president in 2010. He's a graduate of Williams College and Columbia Law School and has held a number of teaching positions, including currently in Columbia's Earth Institute.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all. Well, I guess I'm going last, and I wonder whether that has anything to do with either my standing in the polls or the amount of money I've raised for my campaign. But I will try to make up for those deficiencies with the quality of my presentation. And since Susan was good enough to throw a shot across my bow, maybe to test my mettle, I'll throw one back. After she talked about the New Orleans $14 billion upgrade, I just put in 3 words, and you can put in the same 3 words in your search engine, New Orleans barriers sinking. And the first headline that came up is from E&E News, well-regarded news feed on issues like this. After a $14 billion upgrade, New Orleans levees are sinking. Sea level rise and ground subsidence will render the flood barriers inadequate in just 4 years. So congratulate yourselves on not living in New Orleans. I want to thank my colleague Jessica Rolfe for joining me this evening. I want to thank my fellow panelists from the Corps and from Columbia University, and remind you of Professor Austerman's slides on sea level rise, because I'm going to run through a series of problems with the barriers, but I'm going to try to save at least half of my time for what we think are the solutions, because let's face it, we can't not solve these problems. But first you have to understand the problems to know what the right solutions are. The problems with the barriers plan, just to sort of billboard the points I'm going to make, barriers don't solve for sea level rise. Professor Austerman has already alluded to that. Barriers do not do anything to deal with storms that bring heavy rain-driven flooding and sit on top of the region and are not dependent upon storm surge. The damage to the river ecosystem could be catastrophic, looking at precedents and available data and available studies. Barriers, if built, might not even work. I guess New Orleans sort of makes that point. They are so expensive, they are extremely unlikely to be funded. They won't be built for decades, and there are solutions that can be put in place a lot sooner at a lot lower costs. The HAT study process has been extremely fraught, and with very little data in hand. Cliff mentioned that they're going to select a tentatively selected alternative before most of the environmental monitoring and studies are done. And the barriers, most importantly, keep us from focusing energy where it needs to go. It's a siren song. It's a shiny object. One size fits all, one fix. Sure, it's a lot of money, but it'll be worth it. And it's luring us away from where we need to go with false promises of the things to come. So the second half of my remarks will be about what we need to do instead of barriers, whether we call them gates, barriers, or Bernie Sanders. I don't care. We need to do something different. With a problem this big, this challenging, this diverse, one size does not fit all. We need a multi-level solution that's fully adaptable to the many and varied challenges ahead. I'm going to speak a lot about Climate Ready Boston, which is the current gold standard in planning for how to do this right. We need solutions to all three climate-driven threats, not just storm surge, but sea level rise and rain-driven flooding as well. One of the most poorly handled issues is how we need these solutions to be community-based. You know, think of what Greta Thunberg said in the UN. We've had all these years, all of us great leaders and all these great thinkers to solve problems, and we're not doing a very good job. And one of the main reasons we're not doing a very good job is that we don't engage communities effectively, because we don't care enough about communities to actually realize the truth of the notion that those closest to the risk are actually closest to the potential solution. So we need to invest in social infrastructure, not just pour concrete. We need to make peace with the water. That is now the best practice, and it's what's being embraced in what is held up as the prime example of a big barrier type-oriented community. That's what the Netherlands are now doing, and they announced 5 years ago that's what they're going to turn to. We're going to go away from barriers and towards making peace with the water. Onshore solutions that fit the Boston model of multi-level defenses can be arranged jointly with an energy makeover, as they have in Singapore. We can use our efforts to prevent flooding from causing damage and harm to human health, life and limb, to co-locate energy-saving measures that will actually reduce greenhouse gas loading while it improves the quality and safety of our communities. And onshore can be built far quicker and far cheaper than the in-water barriers. So I'm going to speak in some detail about some of these issues, but again, try to save the majority of my time for the second half items. So there's a huge concern about the barriers, not just causing problems in the short run because they're going to reduce tidal flow, Philip Orton, one of our principal scientists, referred to by Professor Austerman, has said that we have real concerns that have not sufficiently been modeled. He has 10 different things that he wants to study before he believes he can make a conclusion as to how much the barriers will hurt our ecosystem, even when they're open, because there will be large, large installations between the gates that are going to block some tidal flow, divert others, change the course of flooding. But his biggest concern, he says in an article in Yale 360 about a week or two ago, is that in a couple of decades with sea level rise, the river will be permanently blocked because we'll have to keep these gates closed on a regular basis. That little barrier in London, 520 meters, that Suzanne referred to, by the way, the barrier that the group that she represents wants to build is not 520 meters, it's 5 miles across, and that's just one of a series of barriers. It's inland, and even those barriers we find to have caused very significant adverse impacts. But in case you want to know what other communities are doing, London, the United Kingdom, that little 500-meter barrier is inland. There's talk of a barrier like the one that's being proposed here for the lower harbor, but they're not going to make any decision on that until 2050. They're going to see what they can do in the meanwhile to protect their communities without destroying the ecosystems. We have significant issues associated with the risk of reflected wave energy. Constituents ask if the tall barriers will cause flooding in adjacent areas outside the barriers, and the answer is yes. That's a great concern for the Army Corps that they are studying. Once you get a situation where you put in these big barriers, as they did in the Netherlands, the so-called Eastern Scheldt project, you start to see what you find after you put them in terms of environmental impacts. Storm surge barriers greatly affect intertidal exchange because they significantly constrict the tidal flow, and they were found to severely affect the ecosystem of the inner bay of the Eastern Scheldt. This is one of the reasons why the Netherlands is not building these barriers anymore. A modeling study of potential impacts of storm surge for Boston Harbor found that tidal amplitude would change, circulation patterns would be drastically altered, and as closures became more frequent, the barriers would degrade water quality, destabilize shorelines, lower dissolved oxygen levels, decrease benthic biodiversity. And you find that the Boston study concludes, instead of building in-water barriers, let's build shoreline-based defenses. Restored marshes, deployable flood walls, elevated waterfront parks, plazas, etc. The London Thames barrier, a government report on the barrier's impacts predicts that 3,000 acres will be required to replace lost habitat over the life of the barriers. The Venice Moes project, which pointedly was not invoked by Suzanne, is extremely problematic. It is many years behind schedule. The gates are rusting. You know, I hate to mention this with Cliff here, but I'm going to quote something from one of Cliff's colleagues that he put in, and I'm not going to name the name, but this is in the Villager magazine from about a year ago. You have the concern that all those gates have to work perfectly while that storm is approaching, and there's really no way to test those systems until there's a storm in place. No way to test those systems, which will cost between $60 and $100 billion. And by the way, cost overruns are a lot more likely than cost savings. The Big Dig in Boston had 190% cost overrun. So let's say you find a way to get funding for a $68 to $250 billion project, which is quite fanciful, considering that we had a wonderful cross-harbor tunnel project between New York and New Jersey that would have cost a tenth as much, and the federal government refused to find the money for that. Now, this fellow from the Corps says, but the flip side is, and this is starting to get into solutions, you have measures that are tailored for different areas. You take an approach where you have less area at risk if any one of the measures should fail for whatever reasons, whether it's poor maintenance over time, whatever the conditions are. So as you can tell, the idea that you can somehow solve all of our problems with a solution that doesn't handle the biggest, most regular problem, which is sea level rise, which you will have every day of your lives, no matter whether you're 6 or 96, and by the time, if you're 6, you're 56, or however old you are, in 50 years, you're going to have about 3 feet. And that's going to be in our communities, and the barriers will do nothing for that unless you close the barriers, destroy the ecosystem, trap all the pollution from those storms within the barriers, which is currently flushed out into the open water and diluted and made less serious. So, again, a couple of minutes on solutions. When a problem this big, this challenging, this diverse, you should look at the 1997 New York City Watershed Agreement. Some of you have probably studied that agreement. The idea was, do we spend $10 billion on a water filtration plant and treat water at the end of the system, or do we do measures that will cost perhaps less than $1 billion and have a multi-level approach where you protect the reservoirs with open land buffers, you improve infrastructure in the communities, you help communities create green jobs, and they chose the solution that was multi-level, much less expensive, and it's done a wonderful job of protecting our drinking water. There is a strong analogy here. We can't put all our marbles in a basket that would require this sort of spending to solve only one of the 2 major problems. Now, Climate Ready Boston, I mentioned, they have rejected barriers. The Netherlands is rejecting barriers. The Thames, London isn't even thinking about the big barriers until 2050. But there are several principles that the Climate Ready Boston plan has embraced. 1, you need to generate multiple benefits for your investments. 2, incorporate local involvement in every design and decision-making phase. And 3, create layers of protection by working at multiple scales. Better building codes, shoreline defenses like berms and living shorelines, elevating and hardening public structures and services, creation of salt marshes, other places for the water to go, construction of green infrastructure to store water, and, in a wonderful phrase from an excellent 2013 article called Adaptation in the New Yorker, quoting our own Klaus Jacob and some of the experts from the Netherlands, you need to create an architecture of accommodation. The water will come, whether in Japan, as we saw this week, because of a storm that dumped an enormous amount of rain in a short time, or whether in Houston, as we saw with nearly 60 inches in some locations, because a storm just stalled, whether because of sea level rise, which you can do nothing about to a certain extent. The water will come. We have to find a way to live with it, and we have to find a way to harness the social capital that we have. We are woefully underinvested in the value of social infrastructure. In Japan, if you look at the most recent New York Times article about it, they said that the communities that did the best were the communities with the strongest social networks, where people went to their neighbors and people worked carefully as communities to solve the problems. Same thing in this adaptation article about the terrible heat wave in Chicago in 1995. Some communities that had very low income suffered terrible losses in terms of loss of life, and some suffered loss of life that was even better than in more well-to-do affluent communities because of the strength of their social network. We ought to have a panel, Suzanne, where the people who get the mic first are the people from the community whose voices are nowhere in this conversation. Hard stop. So to wrap up, all I'll say is, hey, we live here too. I grew up in the New York metro area. I care very deeply about finding solutions, but you're not going to find them in storm barriers. The smart communities are going away from them. We've wasted $14 billion in New Orleans, and we can do so much better in New York. We have to at least do better than Boston, folks. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions before we open it up to everybody to ask your own questions. First, Cliff, can you tell us a little bit more about the the timing, you touched on it, but do you have an estimate of when there will be a final decision from the chief of engineers? And then typically, how long does it take for Congress to act? And then how long do you think these various alternatives would take to build?
Are we on? Nope, maybe?
Yeah.
All right. So the timing, and I discussed a little bit, so we have the process where we get this report out next year, and our intent is to then continue the analysis based on that tentative plan. So the chief's report is about 2 years after that. So we're looking at 2022, 2023 for the chief's report. Chief of Engineer signs his report adopting the recommendations that we make, and that report then gets sent to the Assistant Secretary of the Army for that transmittal to Congress to make an authorization.
And
that
am I right that,
process,
just one quick question, am I right that that'll be accompanied by a final environmental impact statement?
correct.
Okay.
So that report, that feasibility report and environmental impact statement would then be transmitted. It's typically, I'll say, a 1 to 2 year period for the authorization process after that's submitted, but it's also dependent on what Congress is doing. So if they're engaged, if they're encouraged to do this, or if they're wrapped up in other things, it could be a while before we get another Water Resources Development Act for that authorization. After that authorization, we need the funding, and that could be a few years out as well.
And then to build it?
And it was discussed before whether the alternatives are less water intrusive, more water intrusive. It could vary between, and I'll say 5 and 25 years, but it will be dependent on the engineering and design that comes after the feasibility study, and it will be dependent on the stream of funding that comes with that.
And finally, can you did address this a little bit, but can you say a little bit more about what sea level rise assumptions are going to be built into the final decision?
So we try to come to a common ground, and between us, state of New York and New Jersey and in New York City, finding that common ground as to using an intermediate level. And I think Jacqueline showed very well all of the possibilities of sea level rise for the next 50 or 100 years out. We use that intermediate level to kind of make a decision first, but planning is an iterative process, so we will have to look back and see if that needs to be adjusted or whether or not our selection is sensitive to the differences in sea level change.
Thank you. Jackie, your chart showed a fairly broad uncertainty range for the future going out. Do you think that over the next 5 years that this kind of decision is going to be made, the uncertainty range is going to get bigger or smaller?
Is that on? Excellent. So I think over the last kind of decade or so, over the last IPCC reports, what has happened is that the estimates have gone up.
The uncertainty range has gone up?
So
or
the estimates have gone up.
the projections about sea level rise have gone up?
Yes, exactly. And the uncertainty range, I don't think was narrowed in the more recent. I don't know if they've gotten wider, but I don't think they were significantly reduced. So I don't think you were saying the next 5 years as a time frame. I think there will be significant uncertainty still, definitely over the next 5 years as well.
Okay. Suzanne, I'd like to give you an opportunity just to respond to what Paul said, and then I'll give Paul an opportunity to respond to what you're going to say.
Okay, so the community input, the HAT study has been working very hard to get the community involved in all of the areas that are under consideration. The Netherlands already have barriers, and so now they're focusing on rivers. The project that is under study by Philip Orton of Stevens University studied storm surge gates at 4 closure points. Studied it at closed, which is good. Studied it at 75%, which was good. But then he took his other 2 points and he studied it at 42 and 38. I mean, why? You should, if you're going to study a storm surge permeability, why not get down to, say, even 25% or the 15%, which is what the Thames barrier permeability allows. The modeling on the Boston Harbor, I'm happy to hear about that because the Nietzsche partner that we have is an attorney in Boston and is working on that project, so we're very happy with the results there as well. No true way to test the gates until a storm surge. Well, of course you test the gates, like engineering and, you know, maintenance. This is what you do. You test things before a storm, before any tragedy would happen. No one is looking to close barriers permanently. Have I gone far enough? And then I'm not quite sure what underinvested in social structure works. So we're saying that if we allow the people in Coney Island to be flooded once again, that somehow, however, they can network and make a raft or something. I don't know what he's talking about.
Paul?
Well, I'm going to take a shot at the most important point, which is communities are the ones who are going to solve this problem when we haven't been able to. And if you think that means we'll ask them to put rafts together, then we definitely have to have lunch. And you have to have lunch with some of these people in the communities who are saying, look, I don't want to be vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, Phil Orton, and I went over all 70 of his slides before this. I actually went to school at this law school, so I'm not a scientist, but I try to make up for that by studying what Phil Orton actually says. He said even if there was a 90% flow-through, there's a concern that the barrier gates can cause a lot of turbulence. We don't know what the impact would be on organisms. There's a huge amount of unknowns, and anyone who says that they know doesn't know. And he's got a list of 10 study items. And this is what bothers me about one tentatively selected plan in the early part of 2020, Cliff, that you're going to have a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and you have no way to value the cost to us of the ecological services that could be eliminated if this damage takes place. Bryce admitted that as well in the Yale 360 article. They have no way to create numbers that reflect the damage that they're going to do if the things that have been observed in the Netherlands, that were modeled by Boston, that are concerns to Phil Orton, come to pass. And so we come back to the idea of a partial solution that will be too expensive to build, that has failed miserably for $14 billion in New Orleans, and which doesn't solve the larger, more regular part of our problem, sea level rise.
We have about 15 minutes. I'll invite questions. Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Please.
Yeah. Just to address the one point. So I did put up the slide that shows the environmental considerations that will be considered. Now, to try to reduce the scope of the effort for any feasibility study, we try not to do everything for every single alternative that we have. So we're going to make some recommendation for a tentatively selected plan, but that iterative planning process may find out that rather than doing all of those efforts for one plan, we may need to come back and see what the impact on plan selection may have if we did the same thing on other plans. So there is definitely an intent to look at the environmental effects of any barrier that we'd be putting in.
But very, very briefly, without ecosystem services valued, the cost-benefit ratios are fundamentally flawed. And they admit they have no way, Congress has given them no way to value those ecosystem services. Even if we had the data to give you those values, they can't input them to the system.
So I'll invite, hopefully, short questions, and when I call on you, please push the button so that the microphone could work. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure, and then you. No, you. Lady with the pink scarf.
Thank you.
No, you're not the lady with the pink scarf.
This is a question that is related, but I'm wondering if in all of your studies, if anyone looked at data, if these billions of dollars were invested in renewable energy sources so that the sea level rise will be halted eventually, And I'm just wondering if that has been taken into consideration in any of these studies, the prevention of sea level rise with renewable energy.
So I'll take a crack at that, which is that an enormous amount of work is being done, including here at Columbia, on renewable energy, but that no amount of effort that is plausibly put in is going to have an effect on sea level rise levels for a few decades. That it's a very long, it takes a long time for a benefit to be realized. Jackie, as a scientist, do you want to?
Second that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kevin. Microphone. Kevin, could you use the microphone? There should be a microphone there.
My voice projects.
Okay.
Thank you. A practical problem occurs to me, which an engineer brought to my attention recently. For the outer harbor barrier, you have the entire Hudson watershed emptying out. So don't you have a water column rising in front of the barrier and behind the barrier roughly at the same time? And I realize the tides come and go, so there's some variation there. And since I live in Breezy Point, I'm curious about these things. In fact, I live a couple of 100 yards away from where the barrier would be.
So what we've seen is that there is some tidal flux back and forth, but we'd need to close the system in a way so that the waters that would come from the East River from Long Island Sound wouldn't be those waters that we're trying to empty out the Hudson the other way. But if we didn't have that barrier and there were smaller barriers or whatever it was, we're trying to look at all of the impacts. And what we've also seen from Hurricane Sandy is that those impacts are pretty much short-lived. So that surge comes in, it might be that barrier needs to be closed in a relatively short period of time to then allow for whatever waters need to be flushed back out. So the barrier would then be opened back up to allow for those tidal interchanges.
Okay. Hi.
EPA.
My name is Anthony. Thank you guys for coming out. This question is for anyone on the panel, Suzanne, Jackie, Paul, Michael, Clifford. I was going to ask a technical question, but instead I'm going to ask a moral question because I think that's more important right now. So I want the panel to react to the following statement I'm going to make. It's with regard to the cost issue. So this is the statement. I feel that the cost issue is a canard. It's a false issue, given that budgets are moral issues, and we spend $1 trillion on modernizing nukes, $5 or $6 trillion on wars, criminal wars, and about $19 trillion for a bank bailout, all of which were dangerous and were not constructive to our society. So I wonder if anyone on the panel agrees with that, given that many of the things we're going to have to implement and all the changes we're going to have to make to our economy and our political system will require great investment, to say the least. So anyone on the panel who wants to react, thank you.
I'm going to take it that that's more directed to the Corps of Engineers. So I'll try. So again, back to the problem that we're trying to solve. We've been asked by Congress, by the locals, by local officials, how do we reduce the risk of coastal flooding? Now, our job within the Corps of Engineers is to answer that question. And that takes into all of the different aspects that we're trying to consider. Once we find an answer to that question, and there may be no viable solution, the no action plan is still one of the alternatives. But once we answer that question, it does become someone's responsibility to say whether or not that project, that effort should be funded. There's a host of things, and you mentioned, that America has to deal with. Is it a wise investment in our resources to protect New York and New Jersey from the impacts of coastal storm risks? That question becomes out of our hands, and someone then makes that decision. The Chief of Engineer's responsibility is to answer the question that's posed to him and the problem that we're trying to solve. And then it becomes other elected officials' responsibility or challenge to answer how to authorize or appropriate money for that.
I think the moral. Oh, go ahead, Susan. I think the moral obligation is to invest the community with enough responsibility and power that they can actually develop the political will that could fund smart solutions. You want a project to succeed, have a lot of constituents involved in its conceptualization who will become its advocates. You know, sometimes 200 people can make a difference to getting a bill passed, but if you want money in the billions to be allocated, you give the community a hand in the design. That's the first thing. The second is the moral obligation is to solve for flooding risk. That was actually a debate ahead as to, do we call this a panel about solving storm surge, or do we call it a panel about solving flooding risk? If your moral obligation is to protect people from flooding, you don't build barriers that could cost as much as 60 billion or more with overruns, when the alternatives will allow you to solve two problems for a fraction of that amount. I know that sounds like a weird hybrid of moral and utilitarian, but that's the way my brain is working tonight, sorry.
Okay, so there are an awful lot of things that are necessary and need, in fact, to be funded across the United States and across the globe. But here we are in New York, and I was part of the reconstruction of 900 houses in Brooklyn and Queens after Sandy, funded by HUD. And to me, the solution isn't to put people back where they were, but rather a more regional solution. And the regional solution is the one I showed you that we're advocating. But this not only protects our people, it also protects our region and our economy. And actually, we're, you know, the whole entire United States of America, because we have the impact of the airports. Most of the commerce comes into New York. So the impact that New York has, I think, certainly equals Houston, and ought to be considered on equal level under the Corps of Engineers and the Congress model as to how things should be funded. Something's going to be funded across the United States. And I would like to advocate, that's what I'm doing now, to have this barrier, this gate system, protecting us and our region.
This was it. No, gray beard, yes.
Hi, I'm Thad Pulaski. I live in Red Hook. I'd like to ask the Corps if there's room in this study for non-structural alternatives, ecosystem services, absolutely. But, you know, with $50 billion, if you divided that up with all the structures in the flood zone, it'd be over $1 million where you could make every house resilient and energy efficient. We could actually go a long way toward mitigating climate change if we were to be smart about this investment. You know, then there'd probably be money left over for more localized solutions driven by, you know, the individual needs of communities, which might be a mix of coastal flooding, but it might be other effects of climate change, urban heat island effect, and every community is really different and they have a different set of needs. And I just think these silver bullet solutions are really sort of 20th century engineering. And those 20th century engineers probably aren't going to be the ones that build this thing anyway. It's going to be the people that are in school now, because it's going to take a long time. And so I think that probably brings another lens to this whole conversation, is that I think people that are coming up today are realizing that we're not fighting nature. We're trying to learn from it and work with it, because after all, we're all just sort of hosted by it.
Thank you. Cliff, do you want to say?
I think that's a great question and great points. And yes, we have been focused on the barriers for the most part, because they make up probably the biggest, if not cost, benefit, and or controversy part of the study. But absolutely, and I think to address sea level change, there are going to be components that are put forward to address those areas that would still be at risk even with barriers in place. There are non-structural components that will be included as alternatives, as we proceed further in the study, there will be natural and nature-based features that will be included, because all of them have to go hand in hand. And I do agree with Paul in the case where it does come from the community level, and it does start with actions that are built within the communities first, and then as they rise up, then what can the local administrations, the state administrations, and then the federal government do in addition to those actions that are going on. So as we proceed further in the study, and I think the next report that you'll see come out does actually start to get into those non-structural solutions, the natural nature-based features, and the impacts on sea level rise to address those things that would still need solutions outside the barriers. Thank you.
Just a brief follow-up. Thank you, Cliff, and thanks for that question. There is a bill at the City Council that's going to be up for a public hearing on October 28th. It's known by its introduction number. It's Intro 1620, and it is to require the creation of a 5-borough, full coast-wide set of solutions that can do the sorts of things that were implicit in the question. And it could be the germinus for the sort of community by community. We have over 60 community boards in New York City, and we have a city council roughly the same size. Each has a stake, because the moral imperative, to go back to the previous question, is that we solve for climate change wherever we can, so that there is the least possible necessary relocation, and that the relocation that has to get done gets done consistent with the new equitable and just national climate platform, which says people need to be able to stay in their communities, but they need to be able to stay in their communities safely. So please tell your city council person that you've looked at Bill 1620 after you've actually looked at it, and please support it if you like it. Yes.
Kate Boycourt, Waterfront Alliance. In terms of the problem that we're trying to solve, and I should just say, I think that all of these things should be studied. You know, we have a real challenge ahead of us, and I think it's important to look at all of them with a scientific basis. But from a cost-benefit standpoint, when sort of sea level rise is not really included at the outset, and I understand that you are limited by your congressional authorization to think about, if we think about, you know, if you poll elected officials or anybody that's working on this issue right now, they want to solve for flooding, whether that be the 3 types of flooding. So you've got storm surge and sea level rise and stormwater. Curious to hear if you find some limitations in your work to look at these things comprehensively, that if lifted, you would be able to really look at that cost-benefit analysis and if those things might change a little bit from the onshore versus the offshore measures.
So I don't think that we necessarily have a limitation, if you will, on looking at sea level rise, and it is part of our analysis going forward. I think there are 2, if not 3 or more separate questions that come to bear out of the bigger question of how do we reduce the risk of coastal storm risk. And it does include the storm surge as well as the climate change. But the sea level rise then becomes an issue that we have to deal with, and I'll say with or without the barriers. And I'll just say, so we did a study and actually got approvals on the Rockaway project. It didn't include the barriers, but it included some storm surge features on the shoreline. But what we did in addition was looked at the bayside and the flooding that they continue to get. And I think we showed some pictures of flooding along the bayside of the Rockaways, and we addressed those by putting in solutions just to address the tidal exchanges that happen within the bay. So there are opportunities to address the sea level changes.
Could I just clarify one point? I think that it's often looked at as an after fact, and I think in terms of really understanding what the damage is related to sea level rise in the long term, when you're not including on the cost benefit, I'm just curious if that's changed.
So, and thanks for clarifying that as well. So when we look at the cost benefit and the analysis, our typical period of analysis is 50 years. So we're including in our modeling that goes in every storm scenario, the sea level rise projections. And that's why we tried to find that middle ground using that intermediate curve and how we're doing that so that we don't have to model every possible scenario for sea level rise, understanding the ranges that are out there as well. So it is part of the calculation that goes on as we define what the plans might be.
So we're running over, but I'll call on Klaus Jacob for the last question.
Before I lead to my question, one comment first. I think your choice of sea level rise is, in my mind, a total misjudgment. If you were to buy an airline ticket and the airline would tell you there's a 50% chance that you don't arrive in San Francisco, but you might fall out of the sky, you wouldn't buy it. You chose sort of, call it the 50th percentile, even though it's not exactly that. So I think for an important project like that, you have to go to a much higher percentile. But my question is the following. We understand that with sea level rise, the barriers will become obsolete. We also are probably in agreement that in 100 or 200 years, we still want to have a greater metropolitan area functional. After 50 or 100 years, the barriers will